Hello. Hi. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Grace Law, and I'm chair of the Department of Architecture here at the GSD. Positions is a series of conversations convened by our department aimed at revealing the positions taken by players on the field of contemporary architecture. The series hopes to unfold the complexity of relations and metaphors to make them explicit, inviting faculty and guests to voice where they stand. Today's position event brings together Eric Höweler and Nader Tehrani to discuss the position or the point of view of Eric's recent book, Design for Construction, Tectonic Imagination in Contemporary Architecture. We're delighted to welcome them both. Let me tell you a little bit about them, though they are very well known to our school. Eric Höweler is a professor of architecture here at the GSD, where he is currently leading Core 3, and this spring will teach cases in contemporary construction where, am I understanding correctly, much of the content of this book was seeded. Eric's advanced design studios cover such topics as housing and urban architecture, climate adaptability, and transit-oriented development. Eric is dedicated to the art of the building, working to integrate environmental and structural systems into the curriculum. Eric is also co-founder of Höweler Yoon. That is a research-driven, multidisciplinary design studio working between art, architecture, and media. Höweler Yoon has a reputation for work that is technologically and formally innovative and informed by human experience and a sensitivity to tectonics. Höweler Yoon has received numerous awards, including the Progressive Architecture Award, the Audi Urban Futures Award, the Design Vanguard Award by Architectural Record, and their work has been widely exhibited, including this year's at the Venice Biennale, where their floating plaza is well received. Analyzing the relationship between design and construction, between conceptual thinking and the constructed building, Eric's book explores projects and practices that span the gaps between these realms by thinking through materials and processes as essential aspects in forging a tectonic imagination. Nader Tehrani is principal of Nader, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an intensive dialogue with the construction industry. With an eye towards collaboration and integrated thinking, Nader enters the discourse on technology, aesthetics, and building protocols as part of a holistic process. Nader will be teaching an option studio with us this coming spring, sited in Miami, and focused on innovative infrastructure. So we look forward to welcoming him more officially this spring. And for his many accomplishments, Nader was the recipient of the 2020 Arnold W. Brunner Memorial Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, to which he was also elected as a member in 2021. Nader was also named the 2022 Design Visionary by the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Museum of Design for his innovation and impact on the field of architecture. He is the recipient of numerous awards, such as being named a United States Artists Fellow, among many others. Nader is a professor at the Cooper Union, where he served as dean from 2015 to 2022, and where he continues to teach today. Nader has taught widely at the Rhode Island School of Design, the Georgia Institute of Technology, University of Toronto, the American Academy in Rome, Yale, MIT, and of course here at the GSD. Thank you very much for joining us, both Eric and Nader. Please.
Thanks, Grace. So Nader and I had a conversation over the weekend already. It went really well. So we talk a lot, and it's great to have a friend and a colleague and a mentor like Nader. I think our whole practice, we've sort of relied on him for advice, for inspiration, and it's a real pleasure to have him here. Often in cases, we bring in speakers, and Nader's a frequent visitor to cases. We often just have a conversation with students in the audience, and it keeps it very casual. And so we'll try to reproduce some of that here today. I did prepare some slides just to introduce you to the book, since it's sort of a book is the excuse for being here. Nader has some slides he'd also prepared. Maybe I'll do a short presentation, he'll do a short presentation, and then we'll have a conversation. and then we'll open it up for the audience. I have the book here. I start the book by sort of setting a scene. It's the scene in 1961 where Göran Utzon picks up the phone, calls his friend and colleague Ove Arup, and he says, "I've solved it." And his enthusiasm for solving it has to do with what he called the spherical solution. He'd been working on this competition for 3 years to figure out how to build the image that he won the competition with. His solution was basically, if all the geometry of the Sydney Opera House is based on a single sphere, the point to surface dimension is constant. And he says, "I've solved it, completely solved." He even talks about its constructibility. And so this beautiful model of the sphere with the extracted sphere segments is his solution. Utzon with a different model of the spheres. And then this is the competition entry. And so when you look at this competition, you see that it's not spheres at all. It's just like petal-like shapes. It's form without the rigor of geometry or the kind of dimensional specificity of the sphere. So for 3 years, he went from here to here. On the jury, maybe you know this, was Saarinen. Saarinen had built the Kresge Auditorium at MIT 3 years before. Saarinen was convinced that a thin shell concrete structure could work. Saarinen probably steered the jury towards Utzon by saying, "Yes, this can work." However, the scales are completely different. And so Utzon's solution was actually not completely solved. It required another 12 years before it would actually be built, and another 3 or 4 years to figure out the actual solution, which was quite different. This is one of those beautiful drawings that describe all the spherical geometry. So this is the final Sydney Opera House as we know it. You do see the sort of self-similarity of those shells. How did we get here? Arup worked on this nonstop from beginning to end. You know, Utzon resigned, was fired, walked away from the project. He never saw the project completed, sadly. So his solution didn't actually solve the problem. In fact, there was years of work ahead to take it from a concept to construction. This is a beautiful model that shows the ribbed solution, which actually was what was constructed, which is actually what allowed that sphere to bring its forces to the ground, right? And so it wasn't a thin shell, 50 millimeter concrete solution. It was actually these heavy precast segments that were resolved by Arup and by M.R. Hornibrook, who was the builder. And so these are drawings produced for those ribs to allow those forces to come to the ground, to get lighter as they rise, and to converge towards the ground. These are drawings produced by 3 researchers, Paolo Stracci, Luciano Cardaluccio, and Paolo Tombesi, and they're historians of construction. They've done an exhaustive study of this, and they've analyzed all the shop drawings. Turns out Utzon did about 160 drawings, Arup did 3,000 drawings, and Hornibrook did 8,000 drawings. You know, so this question of where does the authorship lie? Does it lie in the first 160? Does it lie in the next 3,000? Or in the 8,000 shop drawings that the contractor produced? So this is my sort of opening scene for the book, telling the story of this incredible building that we all know. It is the ultimate architecture. But my point is that the architect didn't solve it by defining its geometry. It took years of development to figure out how to actually build it. The site of construction was actually the site itself, so the site became a factory, a precast factory. And these are some of the images of the formwork that, with the rebar cages that produced the geometries which we now recognize today. So the incredible interior of the hall and the kind of incredible ballet of construction, the sort of delivery of these segments. You know, if you think about architecture as made of parts and how those parts fuse to form a whole, this is an incredible image of one of those parts being hoisted in the air and the kind of heroic efforts to kind of wrangle it and to sort of position it and then to post-tension it to produce the rib that's going to bring all those forces to the ground. So as a kind of opening scene, I thought this was very telling because it reveals the gap between the design solution, quote unquote, and its constructability. And in my class, I really try to emphasize that the translation from concept to construction, from idea to implementation, is actually where we need to work. And it's not about the technical or you know, someone else is going to figure it out. This is the beautiful drawing I showed earlier. When I was looking at this drawing, I noticed the title block. And if you zoom in, the signature there, the initials, RM, Raphael Moneo, right? A young architect, Raphael Moneo, working in Utzon's office. So amazingly, when you start digging and looking, you find evidence and stories sort of embedded in these. And that's one of the things I like to emphasize to my students. It's not about a quick Google. It's actually about digging and looking and comparing and looking at the construction photos and going back and forth and formulating opinions about the buildings that we look at. So cases is about looking carefully. It's about developing a kind of critical stance, a position, if you will, vis-a-vis the work through the means, the material, the medium of architecture. Transitioning from Utzon to Candela, an architect that I think is also well admired, and it's a particular link to Nader. In 1958, Candela built this restaurant in Mexico City, Los Manantiales, which is a thin shell, high par structure, exquisite, I would say. And it produces, this is Candela, as a kind of builder, engineer, architect, sort of blurring the line between those distinct disciplines, thinking through how is it constructed out of straight line segments, the high par, and the labor involved. Who makes it, with what skill, with what tolerance, with what capabilities. And so to produce this requires that labor, it requires that sort of know-how. And that's another sort of case study. Here's Nader, and Nader's a protagonist in the book, and that's why I'm delighted that he's here. Nader also is an admirer of Candela. His Daniels School of Architecture at the University of Toronto was sort of inspired, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, inspired by these high par twists for the skylight over the studios. And the model and the renders show the sort of twisting surfaces. Talking to Nader, he was excited about the prospect of using a high par site cast concrete ruled surface as both a structure, an enclosure, a kind of water management system, doing everything with one system. As I understand it, the contractor looked at this and said, not constructible as designed, which is what we hear a lot. And when the contractor says not constructible as designed, it means that your authority is coming to an end and their authority is picking up, right? So how do we sort of grab that authority, that agency, to be able to execute things in the world without contractors saying, it's not possible, it's not constructible, it won't work that way. So as I understand it, Nader and his team took up this question of the high par, and they said, how do we construct it out of contemporary systems, steel framing, trusses, as well as suspended, lightweight GWB, gypsum wallboard, and using their own shop as a prototype, they constructed this ruled surface in the basement of their studio. They finished it, they mudded it, they sanded it, they painted it, and they said to the contractor, look, we can do this in our own studio. We're just architects. Surely you can do this in Toronto on the real thing. That's as I understand it, a kind of polemical, I can do this too, a kind of taking it up with your own hands. So here's the truss system as constructed and then clad into lightweight GWB. And I think the success story is that Nader is saying, I'm not satisfied to be just design intent. I want to understand the means and methods in order to implement things in the world with the kind of authority and the confidence to say, I know it can happen. I think that's an example of an architect taking those issues, those means and methods into their own hands. There's plenty of reasons why architects don't do that. A lot of them having to do with risk, liability, and so on. So means and methods are these special words. They appear in our contracts that say the architect is responsible for design intent, the contractor is responsible for means and methods, and you're on your own if you sort of step over that line, basically. This is a line that I think governs so much of what architects do, and it explains so much of why the world looks the way it does, particularly here in North America. So I know Nader's taken this question up many times. In my own way, I've sort of thought about this as well. The previous book, Verifying Field, takes those three letters, VIF, and sort of tries to ask, how is that relationship between the site of representation, the drawing, and the site of implementation, the field? The VIF is what establishes a kind of dialogue between the drawing and the field, the architect's intent, and its ultimate execution. So in a previous book, we had looked at this question as a way to think about the space of drawing. This is a drawing I did years ago. a CAD file. And this is the field condition. This is the base of a tower in Hong Kong, where the CAD file translates into the messy, muddy, contingent, expensive, risky world of implementation. Another example of that translation from 1970, Peter Eisenman sort of famously proposed a series of projects that were so abstract. The houses were simply numbered. This, I believe, is House 2. It's a model of House 2, cardboard model. And Peter Eisenman, in a way, articulated a theory of cardboard architecture. He thought cardboard as a kind of non-material was useful to produce the abstraction and the distance from the nuts and bolts and parts that would produce a new whole and allow him to reconceive of architecture through this abstraction. This is the house built with all the nuts and bolts and flashing, presumably. And I think he was sort of enamored by the possibility of distancing the conception of architecture from its implementation that allowed for this emergence of a new language. In his own analysis on the left, Casa del Fascio, a drawing, an analytical drawing of Casa del Fascio. On the right, one of his own houses. And so drawing from that, this is a photograph of House 2, an aerial photograph famously confused for a model photograph. And Peter takes great pleasure in that confusion. If someone mislabeled this as model and its building, he liked that. Looking at Casa del Fascio, which I did, I went to look for it. I found it. I was looking at the parts, and amazingly, this building is so monolithic. It's very hard to read what are the layers, what are the part-to-whole relationships, where are the joints. But they're there. You know, the sill laps the face, right? Appropriately so. It's shedding water, right? There's no drip edge. It's all flush. But we see the relationship of parts coming together at this sort of window sill detail. And even the base of the stairs, we see the kind of notching and interlocking of these three-dimensional blocks of stone. So even though Peter's admiring the kind of abstraction of Tehrani's architecture, he's actually assembling the parts in reality in the field out of solids and planes and specific types of stone. Fast forward, 1921, Mies van der Rohe is drawing an idea of a skyscraper, not sure how to build it. Years, decades ahead of the real possibility of executing this crystal tower, 30 years before the first curtain wall building would emerge. Frank Gehry similarly imagining compound curvature years before it would actually be possible to implement. And in the book, I look at the Stata Center because it's conveniently down the street. 2002 was a few years after Bilbao, but it has many of the same problems and challenges of Bilbao. In a way, Gehry's work evolves, and each building tests a different technique, whether it's ruled surfaces, whether it's compound curvatures, whether it's tiling or panelizing, and they're useful to look at. In the book, I ask, what is the state of the art? And actually, I talk about this building across the street. Gehry's building 2002, state of the art was this voluptuous form. 2025, state of the art is something else. It's something much tauter, much crisper. This is an extremely high performance, closed cavity, unitized curtain wall designed by SOM, executed by Permis de Lisa. I also look down Vassar Street, the Met warehouse by Diller Scofidio. You could also say this is an indicator of our moment today. On the one hand, Gehry was about innovative form. SOM is about perfect assembly and execution. This seems to be signaling a contemporary that's different. This is about embodied energy, reuse, and these precise cuts to allow for its sort of reoccupation, its redeployment from a warehouse to a school of architecture. And even in the detailing, Diller Scofidio shows us the relationship of the historic masonry facade with the jack arch and the sort of irregular, awkwardly disruptive intersection of a new window and an old window, just to highlight that dissonance between the original state and its contemporary state. Also, looking at MIT, I included my own project, risky, but I thought it played well. It's in front of Frank Gehry's building. And the effort to use state-of-the-art fabrication to produce an arch in a kind of unprecedented way. The idea that stone is assembled seamlessly to shed, load, and reveal conspicuous absence of the missing boulder that was meant to signify Sean Collier's disappearance, his death. In the book, I touch on material processes, who makes it, with what skill, what intelligences. I note the UVA walls by Jefferson, Jefferson's obsession with material and calculating the number of bricks for a planar wall with piers and a serpentine wall that's self-stabilizing. And I note the kind of presence of fingerprints within the wall, the kind of trace of human labor that is still inscribed in the bricks at Monticello. So the book asks questions about process, about assembly, about tolerance, and I ask us to consider the idea that architecture is all of these things, and construction is the logical outcome of the design intent all the way through its implementation. So I touch on about 200 projects in the book. Each of them sort of follows and leads up to others, so they're kind of stories that weave through these certain themes. Nader appears a few times in the book. This simple image of a wood siding with tapered ends, for me it suggests that the boards are always individual. They never become a plane. They retain their boardness, their distinct profile, and I find this attention to detail really sort of inspiring. Coming back to the GSD for a minute, we know Gropius emigrated to the US in 1937, became chair in 1938, and in that moment he reshaped the curriculum, the pedagogy at the GSD, departing from the Beaux-Arts tradition, introducing new pedagogical structures, dispensing with architectural history, reformulating the core around a new mode of working. And I like to think about that moment and the sort of radical rethinking of pedagogy in this moment. And where does building technology sit within the curriculum? Where does history sit today? And what is the sort of jostling for the core that these different streams inevitably bring with them? Another protagonist in the book is Frampton. Obviously, the term tectonic is something we associate with him. Frampton was in 1995, but actually earlier in 1983, with 6 points for an architecture of resistance, was formulating a counterposition to the dominant narratives, to, in a way, postmodernism, which was the dominant style at the time, but asking for not an architecture of image, but an architecture of assembly, of parts and joints. And so I asked in the book, what has happened since 1995? How might we use that term tectonic again and sort of update the terms that Frampton laid out in 1995 to contend with contemporary issues such as labor, awareness, climate, embodied energy, and many other things. For Frampton, the idea of parts discretely assembled was sort of his interest, that architecture would sort of disclose how it was made. And I think there's plenty of projects that I think Frampton would recognize as appropriately or correctly tectonic. One of my favorites is Fay Jones's Chapel in the Woods. The parameter here was that no member was larger than what two men could carry through the woods on their own. So no horses, no cars, no trucks, just lumber carried by two people walking through the woods. And this produces its own tectonic, a kind of, I think someone described it as a kind of a cloud, a thicket, somehow appropriate to the context in the woods. Looking back at history, we see other moments where parts are expressively articulated, like the de Stael Schroeder house. But zooming up to the present, I find a kind of resonance with Anton and Deborah's, what's this house called? Emeroscopium house, right? All these sort of sliding parts. But whereas de Stael was trying to create a kind of a house that has no gravity, right? It's like a von Duesberg axonometric, right? Ensemble is really assembling parts with gravity. You know, that granite block is the counterweight that keeps all these cantilevered pieces in equilibrium. So I like looking back and forward, finding contemporary examples of thinking through tectonics and assembly to find a kind of form of expression. There is a chapter on form, force, and gesture. This is one of my favorite chapters to research and write about. We know the Statue of Liberty as a monument. Is it also a work of architecture? The structure on the inside, designed by Gustav Eiffel, includes a tapered truss and a secondary irregular set of diagonalized members. I like this diagram because it shows the wind load curve as this sort of curve superimposed on the elevation. If we mirror that curve, we get something that looks also quite familiar, the Eiffel Tower by Gustav Eiffel, who is sort of pantomiming in a way the kind of body relationship to the building and its sort of spreading of its feet to stabilize itself. But it's also a gesture. It's a diagram of wind forces and the idealized form to resist them. Looking again at the structure of the Statue of Liberty, we see this tapered truss, which reminds us again of something familiar like the Hancock Building. So lurking within the Statue of Liberty, there are these two other sort of structural paradigms where force is translated into form in really explicit ways. The last chapter I touch on is called Afterlives of Architecture, what to do with architecture after it's become obsolete. And I look at a number of strategies for dealing with reuse or material. This is a vignette of Guangzhou's Ningbo Museum, which looks at the sort of, in a way, the wreckage or the detritus of the demolition of so many historic Chinese cities, and then reassembled as a new museum. I look at extraction. Where does material come from? How is it being redeployed? And one of my favorite projects in the book is this project by Hana Studio, based in Ithaca, where they've used a robot to carve a tree into layers that are sympathetic to the geometry of the tree, and therefore producing curvature not as an exception but as a kind of norm. And the house has a kind of swelling and buckling that doesn't come from outside but actually emerges from within. That the tree is still lurking within each board, and its expression as a bay window or a canopy over the door sort of comes from that. And I find hints of the future of architecture in projects like this that are prototyping different approaches, different starting points to arrive at different endpoints. So maybe with that, and then I've got two slides. Famously, Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of testing, and then this is Skylar Tibbetts' sort of design for demolition, basically a column that could be undone because it uses no mortar but simply string as a binding agent. So these are hints of a future. I try to just show a quick cross-section through some of the themes in the book, just to give you a kind of overview, a kind of, what do you call it, a trailer, if you will, to mix medias. Maybe I'll hand it over to Nader for his presentation.
Okay. So I won't show images. We can save the images for later. And first and foremost, just thanks for having me join you as an interlocutor. Before beginning into a more casual dialogue, a couple of formalities, a few comments that I think are important to acknowledge, to frame, and to contextualize. First, in reading your book, I was thoroughly surprised at my presence within it. For a long time, I've enjoyed participating in your course at the GSD. I followed your trajectory in both practice and academia. We have chatted casually here and there, but this book brings an organization and thoughtfulness to questions of construction and tectonics that I simply think are overlooked, and certainly things I've never formalized in the way that you have. I've written snippets of this and that here and there, but they're more focused on the kind of biases that I bring to things, and maybe that will happen today also. I've often thought that some of the best architectural conversations are between people born in different centuries, divided by both time and geography. In this case, we've both been co-present in these concerns, almost neighbors, even if we have not explicitly engaged in the dialogue we're about to have today. So in this sense, this is still unrehearsed, despite our knowledge of each other's work. Second, the book brings to the foreground a pedagogical problem that you brought up, and something that we've grappled with as educators for a long time, and namely how to teach design in a field that's all about construction, or vice versa, depending on how you want to frame it. More specifically, if we look back at the varied schools of thought, from the Beaux-Arts to the Ponts et Chaussées, or from design-based curricula to technical universities, they both suffer a dilemma that can be described as two sides of the same coin. One where technical courses are simply saddlebagged onto the curriculum as a bureaucratic imperative, because design is really what matters. And on the other, where the positivism of intelligent problem solving almost always misses the delight of design play, the production of problems rather than the solving of them, and an evasion of design as a linear problem. That is, that it's construed as a linear problem, not as something that expands. I think that your course in this book begin to take on this false dichotomy, even when you don't always present it that way. And this is what I'm going to try to get you to clarify in this discussion. Despite this, or maybe precisely because of it, it's hard to describe where one puts this book in one's library. Is it under the building technologies shelf, design theory? Is it simply a textbook for the course? Or does it aptly fit under another category that identifies its many narratives as part of the storytelling genre? And for those of you who've not read the book or flipped through it, there is another structure that's embedded in there that's not part of the chapters, but it's certain genealogies. Indeed, while you identify many guiding themes in your chapters, you also curate a series of precise genealogies from one building to the next, as if they build on each other to tell a larger story. These genealogies are entirely constructed, artificial, if you will, but also a persuasive part of being able to narrate a story of construction and evolution, even when the buildings are not necessarily linked in a teleological or causal relationship. They effectively build a discursive plume within which we constantly operate, and that's what matters. In this sense, one can even imagine this to be the first volume of several, where different stories, genealogies, and construction cultures are explored. There's many continents and material sensibilities that are left out, but there is, at some point, you have to close the chapters. There are many themes to explore and discuss, but maybe one stands out because of its centrality to the architectural discipline, and namely the dual function of construction and tectonics in buildings, what sometimes converge, most often diverge, and are the basis of many mythologies that produce a disciplinary morality that pervades education. I've struggled with this an entire career, in great part because I've had to learn the means and methods of different trades for almost every project we've taken on. And just to be clear for the students in the audience, when we went to school, this building technologies course was saddlebagged. It was something off the side, or there were the other kind of students who, for whatever reason, did construction in their summer jobs. I was not one of them, but so we graduated with absolute illiteracy about buildings, and so buildings. My knowledge of building came from graphic standards. That is not to say I had zero construction knowledge, but it comes from a manual of some sort. So, and so taking on different traits for almost every project we've taken on, and they've become a central part of the agency that we've brought to our ability to control, deliver, or communicate their ideas. Your story about the Daniels was not incorrect. It was spot on, but you failed to say that it was all theater. I mean, you don't actually have power unless you build it yourself. So it's a kind of exercise of theater where you're playing poker and waging a peaceful warfare with a contractor who's betting that they can do it cheaper and make more profit, and you're saying, no, there's a way of doing this, and we can take $1 million off of it. And it's a game of chicken, basically. So I want to underscore the theatrics as part of this, because sometimes construction is something you do with your own hands, and I'm not unimpressed by that, but that's not what we're in this for. Sometimes it's a disciplinary knowledge that you bring to it because it's all rhetorical. You are there to make an argument. So this is to say that I have had to delve deep into the technical aspects of construction in order to challenge conventions sometimes to solve architectural problems, or to insinuate small inventions. We don't do big inventions in architecture most of the time. You do little leaps, little steps. Some of you know these projects, so excuse me if I'm not using images. Think of the variable bond of Casa La Roca. The simple sliding of the bonding of the brick produces an opportunity that the Flemish bond or the static bond does not. Lemaisure's staggered truss system is something that we adopted for the McAllen building. It was something we had to understand in order not to have shear walls, to allow for the flexibility of units to stack on top of each other without having plumbing risers staggering with them. That was a fundamental invention that, in a way, we owe to Lemaitre. He didn't do the building type. He did the structural type that preempted the possibility of doing a building that can go in a very facile way from a sort of a rental apartment building to an ownership model. And this is important because of the crisis of 2008, where essentially the developer went bankrupt and the building had to revert overnight into a different model. So if there's any real estate folks out there, you'll appreciate this. Yeah? Or the compressive catenary installation at the BSA, essentially a failed project, but let's say what I call a productive failure that is central to the way that you allow yourself to take on experiments, speculations that are a central part of being able to translate them into other means. At the end, the Melbourne School of Design is an offshoot of that, not literally, but conceptually. So these projects all revolve around palpable technical questions that are central to their conceptual validity, even when they fail, as I say. At the same time, and maybe more importantly, the role of tectonics has led us into another level of complexity where representation becomes central to construction facts. That is to say, as architects, we get to select what we expose or conceal, what we amplify or diminish, or effectively how a building's elements are broadly communicated to a diverse audience whose literacy also varies between the conventional experience of Aunt Martha to the erudite reader of architecture, you in the audience. But, what I'm doing is I'm introducing the linguistic model where rhetoric, things that are elliptical or hyperbolized become a choice that you make in architecture, despite all of the material agencies that you are bringing into the design process. A classic example. If the means and methods of constructing a Greek column involved the quarrying of a stone, the carving of segments into cylindrical drums, their stacking one on top of the next in accordance with the capacity of hoists, the alignment of a central hole to allow for adjustments of the drums, tolerances, the metal peg that secures the positioning of the drum, none of these explain the idea of entasis, what I will argue to be entirely irrelevant to the means and methods of construction. The bulge of the column, presumably the expression of weight as it is argued, optics on other hands, but I'll go with the weight one, brings an animate quality to an otherwise petrified medium, forcing it to communicate what it does not want to do. Here I'm recalling what Kahn was asking of the brick, what it wants to be. Part of the critical content of this book then revolves around the tension between the presumed truth of construction and the fiction of representation. What I might invert to say the reality of representation that hides the facts of construction almost always. The inversion is not entirely arbitrary, as it posits the idea that the structure is more often in service of the surface, of the ornament of the building, or the ornament of the building gets to dictate how little or how much of the building's interiors are communicated. Ideologically, the structure has commonly been presented as host, the decoration as parasite, and this inversion helps to recalibrate this equation that architects most often work from the finished effect on the outside back into the core of the building to situate its organs, even if the process of design dictates the opposite. We may go from abstraction to development, but actually, if you think of what we call the catalytic detail, if you're thinking at many scales at one time, you may be working from the corner detail, and then later on you figure out the structural grid. If all of this is not already self-evident to this audience, it's important to reckon with the mission of this book, and I may be wrong about the mission, but you can correct me too, to take on contemporary practice. You bring up the word contemporary to mean something. I'm going to ask you what that means. That is to say, beyond history and the rich precedents it brings to our minds, the contemporary methods of construction vary so much that we need to reevaluate how we situate discourse around emerging paradigms. For instance, with the emergence of the rain screen, what seems to be omnipresent in all new buildings, it has all but sealed the divorce between building representation and performance. What tectonic ethics come with this new territory? Absolute laissez-faire, moderate freedom, or a self-imposed set of constraints? Just anything goes, who knows? So, Eric, among the many other themes I hope we may be able to explore in the short time we have today, I'll just start with the question of tectonics to you. It's been defined by various theorists and historians in distinct ways with different areas of emphasis. And so can you just start by defining in your terms, expansive as they are, how you want to locate it, whether it is in opposition to construction or in confluence, but in some way, recognizing that you brought Frampton into this. How do we look at it differently today?
Okay. Thanks, Nader. Lots of goodies in there. Your mention of theatricality, it's interesting that this image is on the screen, right? This is Frankler, right, performing, staging a kind of a full-scale structural test to failure, right? His theater craft was meant to, he called reporters to witness this. He sort of loaded the column to 10 times its design load just to prove a point, right? This is a kind of a master of theater as much as a master builder. And the one on the right, the disassembly of this column with a spool that wound the string back allowed this column to basically combust and sort of crumble. So there is a kind of theater to it. And I think in the context of school, I think it's worth saying that it's not about truth so much as it is about argumentation, about building a story, about rhetoric, and constructing an argument than it is about exposing a singular, essential truth. When I read Frampton, it sort of blew my mind. I was like, wow, this is the answer. Then I sort of started to wonder, like, is there a kind of overbearing correctness to this idea, that there's a right way and a wrong way to assemble two pieces of wood? And does that actually promote invention, or does it stifle invention? If there's rightness, then there's really nothing else to try. So I think that kind of suffocating rightness to Frampton's tectonics, I think we've sort of pushed against to say maybe there's other ways to do it. Maybe a wrong way might yield something else. And I think you talked about failures. I think testing to failure, testing the wrong ways to assemble things, maybe that's part of design. Maybe you need to learn it yourself. You need to try it and fail, and then say, maybe the traditional way of assembling shingles is actually smarter. Like, you wouldn't assemble shingles like this, right? Mm-hmm. But I think tectonics is a word that's sort of come in and out of favor, certainly within schools of architecture. And I think it's probably time for a kind of a revivalism, maybe with some new terms. So whereas Frampton was writing at a moment, say in 1983, prior to a kind of completely globalized sort of supply chain, he was writing before a completely globalized practice, and probably before we understood the kind of questions of embodied energy. He was talking about localizing to find a site specificity, to find the essence of place, to try to manifest that through a regionally appropriate set of forms. Whereas I don't think we have that idea that there is a kind of essential quality in Japan that's different from regions nearby, but slightly different. So I think it's good to have someone to push against. I tell my students, when you find a text that's so good, but it was written 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it's probably time to update it. Maybe take Frampton's text and see if you can bring it into the present. I think in some ways I tried to do that with tectonic culture. Ask the questions about labor that Frampton wasn't asking. Ask the questions about assembly, embodied energy, and try to bring it into the present.
But out of this comes a certain ethic. The book, let's say, the book is successful in part because it's encyclopedic. It gives you many perspectives, many points of view. But I also know, because you are a practitioner, you are also very selective in what you do and you don't do. And so I'm asking you also to step out of your role as author and somehow define an ethic around which certain projects operate that you prefer as something that is somehow pedagogically more persuasive or theoretically more interesting. I'm asking you not to be neutral about your own genealogies.
Yeah. You said you were going to do this.
It is about positions. So you have to, I'm asking you to take more of a, you cannot be flat in terms of the whole book. There are things that we love and there's things that we just dislike.
Yes.
I hope.
Yes. No, I'm not suggesting that there's a lack of discernment. Certainly there's projects that are in and there's projects that are not in. But I think your question about anything goes, I think, is a good question to ask at this moment, where there's a kind of abundance of possible, every possible style, every possible approach. You know, Scott talks about this, the post-problematic, which I think is a great term. If we're living in the post-problematic, how do we choose what to build? How do we make decisions? How do we bring a kind of discerning approach to architecture? Certainly there's things that I appreciate, and I try to include those in the book. I'm not going to say for or against. I don't think we live in that world anymore, the kind of whites and grays or whites and blacks or whatever, the post or neos. I think we're in a kind of post-ism kind of world. I think there is discernment, and I would say in the face of like spectacle, like maybe Status Center represents spectacle at a certain moment. I would vote for nuance. You know, so it's not about all the bells and whistles, but it's about a kind of a way of bringing things together that maybe you don't notice right away. Maybe there's a kind of nuance of discovery. Maybe there's a kind of second look or a third look. I write about that in the other book where I talk about the kind of make you look twice, the second glance of. So maybe not Stata, but I mean I do prefer the Schwartzman, the Skidmore building across the street. It's so refined, it's so elegant. At first glance, it's a box. At second glance, you notice the overhang. At third glance, you notice the steel frame. The fourth glance, you realize that the gravity load of the glass can't possibly be carried by the structural silicone, and you wonder how is it actually being supported. Mm-hmm. And then you see the little strut that picks up the frame that is actually wrapping around and supporting the glass. I think that's a building that invites multiple views, multiple vistas.
I'm curious about that. This is possibly petty, I'm not sure, but the genealogy that includes that, I mean, it goes down Vassar Street, so it makes geographic sense, but it eliminates Tom Pfeiffer's building out of that equation. It also eliminates Zumthor's museum out of that equation, which...
This one's better.
Huh?
This one's better.
Okay, so tell us why then.
Better for two reasons. Zumthor's Bregenz is not, it's a rain screen, so there's no barrier. It's simply glass hanging on the building.
Yeah.
The real barrier is on the inside, so dirt and dust accumulates behind it, and it's impossible to clean. So Bregenz...
It's a different animal.
Different animal. It's a degree, a difference of kind, not a difference of degree. Tom Pfeiffer's building in D.C., very similar. Slipped in plan, slipped in section, but the gravity load for that glass is carried by a small casting that's hanging underneath it. But if you look underneath it, it's quite unsatisfying to discover the little bracket that picks up the glass. So they're all learning from each other, and that's the point of this book, is can we present a series of examples such that when it's your turn to design the next version of this, you're starting from a point of maximum understanding and information. You're not inventing it from scratch. I don't think we're really inventing things. As you say, we're tuning and improving and tweaking.
Yeah.
This is the better one, I think.
I brought up the issue of the rain screen, which to me is the a kind of the extreme of demonstrating that maybe architecture was never about construction in the sense that you bring up about the new brutalism. It's just the skin is so divorced and can do so many different things from what the structural constitution of the building is, that it produces a kind of laissez-faire condition. This,
I would argue the rain screen is not laissez-faire and is not non-performative. I mean, the rain screen is actually protecting the membrane,
right,
which is underneath it. It's actually reducing the kind of pressure on the inner layer,
correct,
such that the inner layer can resist and reject moisture.
right.
Right. So it is depressurizing the wall before it reaches the actual layer. So the rain screen is both protective and performative.
Yeah.
It's not decorative. I would say rain screens are not decorative. And
No, I
think
know, but I'm still going back. The image must be important for you.
it certainly is.
The image can be red or blue. The image can be shingled. or it can be bricked. It can be many things. And there's a cultural dimension to those decisions that are paradigmatic to our moment. But that was actually my entry into another chapter that you speak to, which maybe generationally speaks to our moment, 30, 40 years ago. And it's this moment between Kahn and Venturi, where thickness and thinness are part of a struggle that they're trying to take on. In the context of Kahn, a post-war architect dealing with problems of the steel and concrete frame, whether as infill or curtain wall, and the problem of thinness and how to give depth to thinness. In the context of Venturi, the wholesale acceptance of thinness as the medium itself and a kind of medium of speculation, exploration, radicalization in the context of thin skins, or even when there are thick skins, they are represented as thin. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because that also invites maybe a different kind of investment in the question of ethics that I bring up, in the context of Kahn, where the representation is mirrored by spatial accommodations on the interior that you cannot cannot divorce. He does not allow you to divorce, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think of these two as opposites, maybe. One invested in a kind of...
They're not opposites for me. I'm arguing they're the same, actually.
Yes, and that's what's sort of radically interesting to think about. If they're operating within the same construction culture, they're both dealing with the same crappy materials, the same cavity wall construction, the same labor source, the same materials to apply to the building. So in a way, they're radically equalized by the construction context in which they're working. I think Kahn manages to produce depth and thickness by articulating the facade, by turning material into a series of piers, using solidity and voids. I'm thinking about the first Unitarian church to produce the kind of sense of depth and relief. Whereas Venturi here in this image in the Columbus fire station celebrates thinness as a kind of arbitrary graphic that's been applied to a facade, and the sort of misregistration of the white figure and the window and the lintel over the sort of engine portal. To think that they're both working with the same construction industry, one's asking them to make it appear thick, to produce the sense of monument, and one's saying, let's show how thin it is, right? The picture with my thumb under it shows just how thin that glazed white brick is. It's really just like a 2 millimeter thickness. And then the image next to it is Michael Maltzon's building at MIT, which is contemporary, I would say, within the last 4 years, that also turns the corner between white and terracotta without any articulated dimension. So Michael Maltzon's playing with the same logic as Venturi, but in a way his bricks are even thinner.
Am I correct that that's basically just a tile?
Yeah, it's a tile that snaps into an extrusion that gets mortared. So it's about an inch thick. So materials are getting thinner and thinner, and to some extent Venturi sort of embraced its thinness, refused to show it turning the corner, whereas Kahn is working really hard to show us the returns, to show us the dimension of the stone. The outside corner and the inside corner are often places where seams are evident, where the theater sort of falls apart, or the scene or the prop reveals its actual thinness.
I'm mindful, Grace, of the time and whether you wanted to open the discussion to the audience, or...
I didn't want to cut you off if you wanted to continue. But I do have a lot of questions, but I don't want to hog the mic. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, and I will open it up to the floor. When Nader asks the question, Eric, what is the ethic you are proposing? Let's just say, what is that ethic? What is the thread by which, for example, certain projects are selected for this book and or eliminated? I mean, it's a very particular kind of question because it suggests that you, in fact, there is a subjective idea in your mind about what gets included and whatnot. And it's not necessarily about, let's say, the authenticity of construction per se anymore. Maybe I just paraphrase what you've been saying. So would it be accurate to say that at some level, the proposal of the ethic is, to me, if you look through the table of the contents of the book and you kind of, you're flipping through it very quickly, you might say that on the one hand, you are selecting very specifically projects that are using conventional construction modalities in an interesting way and or that are leaning in very specifically to the hyperlocal. So it's on the one hand ubiquitously global and or extremely hyperlocal, and or it's the dance between those two things that seem to produce a kind of ethic. Do you think that's onto something, that you're trying to suggest something with this? I think it'd be great to hear a little bit more about what constitutes the culling of these particular projects. What is in your mind?
I mean, I don't think it's any singular criteria. I think some are very teachable. They're great examples, and some are not. And so on one selection criteria is like, this is a great example of this question of thinness and the inability, the disinterestedness in turning a corner. So putting Venturi next to Maltzen here, I think rhetorically, it's like, that was then, this is now, we're still playing this game, and the materials are even thinner. The kind of cost of construction, the cost of labor has taken us to a point of extreme thinness. So I don't think it's an ethic in terms of like, this is right and wrong. I kind of bristle at the kind of Framptonian, right and wrong, because I think that doesn't lead to invention. If it's categorically wrong, why would you even try? So I like a little bit of misbehavior. I think Sheila Kennedy wrote a great book called Material Misbehaviors, right? Material misuse. Forgive me. Misuses. I'm attributing misbehavior to her misuses. But a fantastic book about like using standard things like 2x4s. Using 2x4s incorrectly and finding different discovery.
Maybe
Just to be clear, I mean, I want to make sure that my question about ethics is not misconstrued as a gauge between what's right and what's wrong. What I'm trying to set up here, and I'm using your book as foundation, is that there's a spectrum of strategies that, if they show anything, is that there's let's say, a productive relativism between different strategies, each of which presumably brings with them a rule set. And according to that rule set, there are ethics. Not because they're right or wrong, but because they are able to exploit different extremes. And so, for me, the example that you bring up of Sana and the window detail in Zollverein, where the frame of the window is inset behind the concrete, it's yet doing all of its performative duties in terms of environmental issues, but at all costs, when you're looking from the outside, you do not see a window as a product, you see a void. And that void, thin as it is, one could say has a direct relationship with Kahn's Exeter, where he pushes the lecterns or whatever, the desks out flush with the brick in order to do the exact opposite with the large windows overhead, which are concealed behind the brick on the other side. That ethic presumably is the result of somebody saying that, the window as a product will never produce a sense of void. And at all cost, I need a void. I need the absence of a thing. I merely need a passage of some sort. That's a very extreme thing. So I guess you had said I want to use examples in this discussion, and I'm sort of inviting you to take us to those extreme conditions where architecture cannot be anything else but that thing. Basically, based on those things that you love or those things that you hate.
I mean, when I sit with a student, they say, well, I'm trying to do this. And I'm like, well, if you're trying to do this, then you should do this, this, and this. Well, I'm trying to do that. Well, then you think about it this way, that way. I'm not saying, you must make your window disappear. If the student says, I want a building that is so abstract, so model-like, that when I look at a window, I don't even see a frame, right? That's the thing about this building, is it looks like a model. It doesn't look like a building. It's like working really hard to flatten it. There's no flashing. There's no frame. And I see kind of mastery in this building. I see an architect working with the full control of all the variables of construction to produce something that looks easy, almost childlike, which is almost impossible to achieve without that sense of mastery.
So because you have this on the screen right now, I think it's useful to talk about. In some ways, I would argue that part of the reason, what you're talking about has to do with a certain kind of level of abstraction and the quality of that abstraction as, when you look at it, both in the elevation and in the models and massings of the project, it starts to suggest, like you said something, I want to link this back to something else that you were talking about when you said the SOM building versus the Bregenz building, that the SOM building is better. But wouldn't you say that our desire for abstraction still persists so strong that many people would argue with you that though the SOM building might be doing certain things better, that the Bregenz building is producing the kind of abstraction that is like aesthetically incredibly satisfying. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that too, because maybe it also picks up on the other question about how the rain screen, this sort of divorce of the rain screen, how the rain screen as a veil. If you play that out in the long horizon of construction, the ability that the backup system and the backup wall does all the work of the weather, of the line of the weather, and the rain screen can representationally do something entirely else or other. Like, what is the outcome or thinking of that outcome?
I think it's incredibly liberatory to be able to disengage the performance of weather and appearance. There's a chapter in the book on monoliths, which is an exhibition that Rodolfo Machado and Rudolfo Curi curated in 1995, coming on the heels of deconstructivist architecture, where all the parts were exploding. Rodolfo and Rudy basically said, we don't want explosion, we don't want parts, we want holes. And it was a counter trend. I remember hearing about it, and I thought, that doesn't make any sense. Like, it's all about disjunction, right? It's Schumi and disjunction. And why are you doing monoliths in an age of exploding buildings? But the control and sophistication to produce a monolith is so much higher than what's required to make an explosion. I mean, they're both difficult. But I found the monolith, which relies often on the rain screen, right? The monolith isn't just a concrete bunker, and it's actually not solid. And it's actually not a monolith. It's made of parts. But the control to produce the impression of a monolith, I find that incredibly sophisticated, and I admire that kind of control. So examples like some of these. The brick in the Santa Fe Hospital by Giancarlo Mansanti is a beautiful, it looks solid, but it dematerializes. And then the Wiley Theater by Josh Ramus and OMA also manages to obscure the normative figure of the window. And the normative figure is what gives it away. It shows its scale, it shows its body, but the control of the skin to produce that illusionistic effect of like, I'm not sure how big it is, I'm not sure if it's heavy or light. I think that's what Rodolfo and Rudy were talking about in the 90s, and I think since the 90s we've had so many other great examples of this type of architecture. I thought, again, you find a text that's out of date, if you update it, that sometimes yields really interesting results.
Let's turn it over. Questions?
Thank you so much for your presentations. My question is, since both of you guys mentioned construction as rhetorical or to make an argument, and I'm wondering, what is your position on, let's say, do you think the argument-making aspect of construction is a consequence of the desire to materialize, to build with matter, or do you think the argumentation part is actually the pursuit? And there's the joy within the discipline of architecture that you solve the problem, and then it's almost like the tasty bits of the disciplinary knowledge. And I'm wondering, what is your personal position on this matter? Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll start and you can end. I just want to clarify, when I said rhetoric, I was borrowing from Silvetti's notion of language as the substance of architecture. That is, architecture produces other architectures. So its materiality, its iconography, its formal spatial qualities are the basis of that, not the words that I lather on top of them. It's not that argument. I'm not diminishing the role of the argument. Your question is still an apt one, but I'm simply trying to clarify that let's say the debate of architecture as matter, as abstract matter, presumes a neutrality that the linguistic model disallows, that the linguistic model says that it is a vehicle of communication. There's a subject, there's an object, there's a recipient, and so all of a sudden you're involved in a language of architecture.
I like the question about joy. Did you say joy? Pleasure, taste. I like a building that gives you pleasure and joy. I think, going back to Monet, a building has to speak for itself, right? He said the loneliness of buildings, right? The architect, solitude.
There's a very tough front row here.
Yeah. The solitude.
There's another one here.
The solitude of buildings. A fantastic essay. The architect cannot explain the building. You can't stand next to your building in perpetuity and explain it. So it has to stand on its own, the solitude, even more beautiful. I like finding things in buildings and discovering them. And I like it if someone would read my buildings and discover things in there. I think so. This question of audience and readership, you always have to imagine, but you can't write those things into buildings. In a way, they have to read them out of the buildings. I think we both grew up in the age of architecture as a kind of semiotic system. But I would say the thinness of buildings, I'm kind of interested in that too. And at a certain point, you think about texture mapping and renderings and rendering culture. And, does the culture of design also manifest itself in the thinness of construction? Like, there's an alignment of thinness and texture mapping, right? We're texture mapping our renderings, contractors are slapping on layers. Is there a cultural moment that we're in? And can architecture produce the joy and the pleasure, but also comment on the thinness of things? That's something I talked about in my previous book, where I talk about the building that doesn't turn the corner, the knife edge, that seems to be one material transitioning to the other. And I think Venturi sort of did it, and so did Michael Maltzan. This refusal to turn the corner is about a thinness. And the brick texture is really a texture map. So the building starts to look like a rendering or an image of a material more than the material itself. And I think that gets away from the kind of authenticity argument, which I think is a losing battle in this moment in contemporary construction, where everything is a vapor barrier and a veneer and a layer. I like the idea that architecture could provide the construction with the joy and the commentary, the ability to say, this is our present moment, and this is how we interpret it and manifest it.
Thank you so much for this great conversation. I love this idea that you update a text that you love. And I was thinking, Frampton, that subtitle of the first, is it 9 points? 6 points. 6 points. We're all getting our titles wrong today. There was an architecture of resistance, and he explains what he's resisting in 1983, and he's resisting the sort of non-place. I think he cites Paul Ricoeur at the start of the modern architecture book, right? The sort of, in a way, he's fearing the moment where we are now. He speaks about the sort of sightlessness, right? What are you resisting now?
Yeah, I mean, I often ask students to look outside and say, why does the world look like this? Why does it look like, actually, it's not too bad here. Some vistas are worse than others, but the world is pretty crappy. I'm resisting that kind of crappiness, the kind of thoughtlessness, the carelessness of architecture. I don't buy the everyday ugly or the normcore whatever. I want, architecture to move us, and I want it to make us look carefully, to build a literate public as opposed to imagine an illiterate and careless audience that doesn't pay attention.
The front row has lots of questions, but I just want to give the students just one more chance, then we can turn it back. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Alex, and I'm in Iman studio right now. Thank you to both for your discussion. And I would like to provide a sort of a counter building or counter architect to the Sana box, which is a Renzo piano, where they also use technique in a very masterful way, but in a very expressive way. So Sana is more like trying to use technique to diagrammatic the building, but Renzo also diagrammatic, but to celebrate the ornament, celebrate the technique. And do you think that at one point that the technique becomes less practical but more ornamental? And where do you draw the line in your practice to sort of balance out the ornamentation of the technique and the practicality of the technique?
I was going to say, did I have a Renzo piano building in the book? I did. I had the New York Times building. Not because I like it, but because it's teachable. It's very clear what the intent is, that the monolithic tall buildings become objects. They become these crude sort of multi-story things, and he sort of peels apart the layers. By offsetting the planes, he's sort of disengaging them from the mass. So it's 4 planes, and it's not a single mass. And then each plane is articulated as parts, and it spreads to produce vision and spandrel conditions. So I think it's masterfully done, but I don't think it's as sophisticated as the Sana box, the Sana window. One is so much more exuberant in its parts, and one produces a kind of a silence in its whole. They're both very teachable. I guess I do have preferences.
But it's a dangerous question, because piano does brilliant matte buildings and dreadful figurative buildings. And so I think you have to be specific about the examples that you're using, because even though he's an architect, an individual author, that doesn't mean that all of his buildings persuade in the same way. Because when I referred to Sana, I meant that building and that detail. So.
Were you thinking of this box or another box? He has a lot of boxes. Yeah, it's a kind of kit of parts. I mean, he's the legacy and the producer of the high tech, right? And one of the few persistent practitioners of the high tech.
I mean, is this one working?
Yes.
So, super minor correction. The first image of the Eisenman house, too, that's the actual house. The white foreground is snow, and if you look carefully, you can see the snow on the beam. So, and that was the photograph that was mistaken for a model. Then the second one was constructed intentionally to make it look like a model, right?
Yep.
So, but the general point persists. For Eisenman, the diagram, the drawing, the model, the building are all equal instances of the idea, and the idea overrides all of them. So the means of construction are meaningless. But anyway, that's not what I wanted. I just wanted to push both of you a little bit more to talk about the sort of contemporary moment when questions of energy use and sustainability and thermal performance seem to be the drivers much more than questions of structure and tectonics. So it's not, you talked about the rain screen, you talked about embodied energy, but the consequence of that has been a kind of thickening of the envelope, not only with the rain screen on the exterior, but also on the interior, and the legibility of structure tends to get lost within that. So I'm just interested in hearing both of you speculate a little bit on how, I don't know if it's a question of recovering the legibility of structure, or how do we deal with this issue today?
You go first.
I mean, interesting, in Core 3, we're grappling with structure. Structure is really foregrounded in Core 3 because we have a building that's both high-rise and long-span. And so this question of structure is inescapable. And so we've been building beautiful structural models and actually using the model to sort of test if it's stiff this way, is it stiff this way? And I think they're yielding lots of interesting feedback. The model we build after the structural model is the enclosure model, where a lot of that gets buried and lost and subsumed within a series of layers. I do think it is ironic that all that structural expression is inevitably wrapped for fire protection, but also for keeping the structure warm, right? In this climate, in this context, we cannot expose the structure lest it sort of become a thermal bridge. So I think those are important lessons to both clarify the structural behavior and expression, and then inevitably sort of swaddle it in all kinds of other layers. How do we bring structure back? I mean, if you look at the ICA, for example, a building I worked on back in the day, the truss is apparent by what it's doing. The proportion of the span and the backspan are so evident. You know there's something doing a lot of work in there. But the structure is completely absorbed by the sheathing and the membrane, to the point where we debated, should we add a fake truss just to be legible? At that point we said, this is ridiculous, let's stop and not play this game. But this legibility of structure can become a kind of pursuit, maybe a rhetorical one, maybe a linguistic one. I think the cantilever itself is telling us that there's some structure there. It's in a way already announcing the necessity of something performative. So maybe that's sufficient.
Brems's counter term is the scenographic. So if maybe you're collapsing the scenographic and the tectonic somehow with the wrapping and the layer.
But there's a difficulty in your question because it's not the wrong question, but it could be the wrong scale at which you're asking the question. My sense is that issues of energy, climate change, and the kind of the crises that we're facing at the planetary level require a different encounter with policy, with urban planning, regional planning, if you wish, global planning for which there is no cooperation right now, and a discussion about macro-urbanism that architecture simply can't take on. But if you ask the same question of architecture, what is interesting is that the sophistication of building systems more broadly, whether you are in the developed, high-tech world or the world that isn't consumed by products, that there's so much flexibility that you don't have to wear green buildings on your sleeves. You can actually achieve great architectural works despite all of that. So that brings it back into a much more conventional architectural discussion, ironically.
Right. No, it's the second question I'm asking.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
We're running out of time, and I first of all really thank you both very much. I think it's been very inspiring to hear about the book, and also Nader, your sort of careful reading and trying to open the thing up. And I hope, just in the spirit of sort of opening up this conversation, because I think there's a lot of other things. A couple of points. I don't know that the term ethic or ethics is the correct one. Whether it's more like judgment, forms of decision-making. Decision-making immediately takes you into a kind of scientific route, but forms of judgment, I probably prefer to ethic, because it's sort of, even though I've used it, it pushes you into a domain which is not to do with the discussion of the architectural project and what it is. So one is that. I think the Frampton and the tectonic, it probably is the case that Frampton, wrote this book also at a time when there's so much emphasis on linguistics and architecture as language,
that's right.
and therefore construction and constructability is in a way a counter-argument to the idea that buildings speak like the way that we talk, which they don't, maybe. But that was very prevalent. Right. But in the process of emphasizing construction, he also, partly deliberately, valorizes the aesthetics of construction, and therefore construction as imageability, construction as appearance. Right. And in some of the projects that you show, you tend to show fragments of construction, which then you speak about them as if they stand for architecture. For example, the Sydney Opera House, it's really the difference between the form of the roof and the operations of a building, and whether there is, what are the correlations between that and what's happening. I think it would be interesting to emphasize a little bit the moment where construction is architecture, or construction is only a part of the architecture. Yeah. I think that distinction is helpful, because if you don't, you'll end up, or there is a danger that we are again valorizing the construction thing in a way. Right. And I don't know where that is sort of, like what's the consequence of that? But I think that the most interesting thing for me, in a way, just hearing Nader start at the beginning and talk about the separation between, let's say, pedagogy of design and pedagogy of construction, is that you now, Eric, are in the enviable position of being the person who's teaching both the construction class and also the integrated design class of third semester. And it would be fantastic to, not now, but at some point, hear how you imagine the reconciliation of what you have got from the book. Because I think you write the book, but you also use the book to, now you reflect in a way that you didn't at the beginning. And I think the kind of the amalgam of these two would be a fantastically interesting thing to, in a way, discuss, maybe with Nader coming back, but just also the whole third semester, the construction course, because we do have an opportunity to discuss this. And frankly, I don't know whether your reflective thinkings are represented or incorporated into the third semester integrated design. So I would like to put on the table the possibility of opening up that kind of conversation in the school. And really, thank you both so much for what you have given us this afternoon, and may it continue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess that's
a wrap.
That requires a response.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks, man.
That's good. Very good.